October 15, 1946. 8-year-old Edda Göring was clutching her father's letter when she was dragged from her palace into a life of poverty. Allies vowed to erase the family name, and the Nazi princess became a pariah. Before she died, she finally revealed how they treated her. Did the Allies overpunish a child, or was it justice? Her 1993 interview and 2015 legal bid exposed everything. But first, her gilded cage before the fall. Princess of Plunder. June 4, 1938, was not just a normal day in Berlin. It was the baptism of Edda Göring, and the Nazi Party turned it into a spectacle that bordered on the divine. Imagine 500 Luftwaffe fighter planes roaring through the sky, a literal iron cloud overhead, just to celebrate the arrival of one baby girl. Her father, Hermann Göring, was the second most powerful man in Germany, and he made sure the world knew his daughter was the undisputed princess of the Third Reich. It was a level of opulence that felt entirely disconnected from the reality of the era. Edda grew up in a place called Hall, which was less of a home and more of a sprawling, gold-leafed palace, tucked away in the Schorfheide forest. It was massive. It had its own gym, a private cinema, and even a miniature railway that ran through the attic. Hermann Göring filled the halls with treasures he had basically shoplifted from all over Europe. We're talking about priceless Rubens paintings and stolen tapestries that covered the walls. And here's the thing that gets really uncomfortable when you think about it for a second. One of the baptism gifts Hitler gave to little Edda was a painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, a masterpiece that had been effectively extorted or looted from Jewish collections. To Edda, however, these weren't political statements or war crimes. They were just the decorations in her nursery. She spent her early years surrounded by Uncle Adolf, who visited frequently and acted like any other doting godfather. To her, Hitler wasn't the architect of the Holocaust. He was just the man who hugged her and brought her expensive dolls. She lived in a world where the Air Fleet funding paid for her silk dresses, and her every whim was met by a staff of dozens. It was a gilded cage where the bars were made of stolen gold. She saw her father as a hero, a man of laughter and medals, totally blinded to the fact that their luxury was built on the systematic plunder of an entire continent. But now, here is where it gets interesting. How does that kind of extreme opulence blind a person to what's happening outside the gates? When you grow up with Hitler as your godfather and your backyard is a stolen forest, does the concept of right and wrong even exist? I've always wondered if you'd trade a palace life like that if you knew it came with history's ultimate curse. Think about that for a second. Would you take the gold if it meant your name was forever tied to the worst atrocities of the century? Drop a comment and tell me your take on that. By 1945, the roar of the Luftwaffe planes was replaced by the sound of Allied bombs, and the walls of Hall finally started to close in. The privilege baseline that Edda had known her entire life was about to be obliterated. Her father was arrested and hauled off to Nuremberg to face justice for crimes that were, quite literally, beyond human comprehension. The transition was brutal. One day, she was the most important child in Germany, and the next, she was a stateless orphan. Hermann Göring's self-harm in his cell shattered the last remnants of that dream world. He chose a cyanide capsule over the hangman's noose, leaving his daughter behind to face the wreckage of his choices. And this is where the story truly begins. The luxury was gone, the godfather was dead, and the world was angry. You have to ask yourself, what did they do to the orphan next? The fall from the palace was only the beginning of a nightmare that lasted the rest of her life. Cottage of cruelty. After the cyanide shattered whatever was left of her childhood, Edda Göring didn't just lose her father, she lost her entire universe. One day, she was the pampered princess of the Third Reich, and the next, she was a prisoner, literally. The Allies didn't just want to punish the men in the high boots, they wanted to dismantle the very memory of them. Edda and her mother, Emmy, were hauled off to internment camps. Imagine an 8-year-old girl who just months ago was playing with Hitler in a gold-leaf palace, now sitting in a cold gray cell. The authorities eventually labeled Emmy a major offender because of her proximity to the Nazi high command. And even though she was just a child, Edda was treated as an extension of that guilt. By 1946, they were moved to a place called Veldenstein. Now, on paper, it sounded okay because it was an old family property, but the reality was a nightmare. They were relegated to a tiny, broken-down cottage on the grounds. It wasn't a home. It was a ruin. There was no running water. There was no electricity. Think about that for a second. This girl went from a palace with a private cinema to carrying heavy buckets of water from a well just to wash her face. She spent her winters huddled in blankets, fetching wood from the forest just to keep from freezing to death. It was a complete and total isolation. The neighbors who once bowed to them now looked the other way, and the local kids were often told to stay far away from the Göring girl. Here is where the legal weight really started to crush them. In 1948, the authorities invoked Control Council Law 38. This was a massive asset seizure designed to strip the Nazi elite of every single cent they made during the war. It didn't matter if it was a baptism gift or a childhood toy. If it was bought with blood money, it was gone. Edda watched as the few treasures she had left, even that Lucas Cranach painting she loved, were snatched away by the state. She was essentially a criminal because of her last name. She was stateless, penniless, and living off the charity of ex-Nazi networks and church groups that were the only ones willing to throw them a bone. Gets interesting. We know her father was a serial killer. Now, here is where it gets interesting. We know her father was a monster, but did an 8-year-old deserve to pay for his sins with years of hunger and cold? Was it fair punishment to make her the face of a regime she didn't choose? Or was it a necessary step to ensure the Nazi ideology never rose again? I'd love to know what you think. Was it justice or just plain cruelty to treat a child this way? Leave a comment, because this is where the debate really gets heated. Even after Emmy was released from the labor camp in 1948, the stigma didn't fade. It actually intensified. Edda tried to go to school, but she was constantly met with rejection. Schools didn't want the Göring name on their rosters. Later on, when she looked for work, the doors stayed shut. Employers would see that name on her ID and immediately end the interview. She was a pariah in a country that was desperately trying to forget people like her father even existed. She wasn't just Edda. She was the daughter of the monster, and every job rejection or cold shoulder in the grocery store felt like another slap in the face from a world that wanted her gone. But wait, it actually got weirder. Despite the poverty and the buckets of water, Emmy never stopped trying to cling to the past. Before the self-harm, she had actually tried to arrange a visit with Hitler to save their status. That desperate loyalty to a dying cause was the atmosphere Edda breathed every day in that drafty cottage. They were living in the shadows of a fallen empire, surrounded by the ghosts of their former life. Edda survived those shadows, but as she grew into a young woman, she realized that the forest poverty was just the first hurdle. Adulthood brought something much more complicated than wood fetching. It brought the German courtrooms and a lifelong battle to get back the gold that the world said she never deserved. The struggle for her father's legacy was just getting started. And get this, The next phase wasn't about survival. It was about a 2015 legal bid that would shock the modern German government to its core. Shrine in the shadows. After Edda finally moved away from the drafty ruins of Weldenstein, she settled into a small flat in Munich's Obersendling district. But if you walked into that apartment during the 1960s or 70s, you wouldn't have found a woman trying to move on. You would have walked directly into a shrine. Her walls were covered with large oil paintings of her father, and his medals and honors were displayed as if they were holy relics. She worked as a medical secretary, living a quiet, almost invisible life under the watchful eye of the authorities, but her social circle was anything but ordinary. She spent her free time surrounded by old Nazi loyalists and right-wing groups who still toasted to the good old days. Now, here is where it gets incredibly complicated. While Edda was busy curating this altar to her father's memory, there was another Göring who proved that the family name didn't have to be a death sentence for your morality. Her uncle, Albert Göring, was the exact opposite of Hermann. Albert was a hero who used his brother's powerful name to falsify travel papers and bribe officials, ultimately saving about 120 Jewish people from the camps. Think about that for a second. The same name that Edda used to justify her victimhood was the same name Albert used to save lives. But Edda almost entirely ignored Albert's legacy. She didn't want the hero. She wanted the father she remembered from the palace. In a rare 1993 interview, she finally let the mask slip, and her words were literally chilling. She didn't apologize. Instead, she claimed the Nuremberg trials were nothing more than victor's justice and a form of revenge. She described the seizure of her father's medals as a deep humiliation and an act of theft. It was clear that the mistreatment she suffered as a child, the poverty, the buckets of water, the social shunning, hadn't humbled her. It had calcified her. She chose to believe her father was a gentle man who was simply misunderstood by history. She used the cruelty she faced after the war as a shield to deflect the undeniable truth of the Holocaust. It makes you stop and wonder, does family love completely blind us to the truth? If your father was responsible for millions of deaths, but he was also the man who tucked you in at night, which version do you believe? It's a heavy question. Does the fact that the Allies treated her harshly as a child justify her spending the rest of her life in total denial? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Does family loyalty have a limit, or is it an absolute? Because this is where the psychology of the Göring name gets truly messy. Edda stayed in that Munich flat for decades, a living ghost of a regime that the rest of the world had buried. She worked her job, she kept her secrets, and she maintained her shrine in the shadows. But as she got older, her quiet resentment turned into a very public, very aggressive legal battle. She wasn't content with just keeping her father's photos anymore. She wanted his money and his stolen treasures back. She decided she was tired of being the silent victim of post-war revenge. In 2015, she launched one last fight that would seal her fate and force the German government to decide once and for all what they truly owed the daughter of a monster. And get this, the result of that court case wasn't just a legal ruling, it was the final nail in the coffin of the Nazi princess legend. One last fight was all she had left. Final defiance denied. April 23, 2015. A 76-year-old woman walked into a Bavarian parliament building with a stack of legal documents that felt like they belonged to a different century. Edda Göring wasn't there to apologize or to find closure. She was there for a payday. She filed a formal petition demanding the restitution of her father's assets that were seized way back in 1948. Her argument was actually pretty calculated. She claimed the post-war government had left her with nothing for subsistence, and that the seizure of her childhood property was a legal overreach. She wanted the blood money back, or at least a significant chunk of it, arguing that, as an individual, she shouldn't have been held liable for the state's collapse. It was her final, loudest defiance against the world that had turned her from a princess into a medical secretary. But here's the thing, the German government didn't even blink. The petition was reviewed by the Legal Affairs Committee, and the rejection was swift, brutal, and unanimous. There was no debate. There was no maybe. The lawmakers cited the 2+4 Treaty and the basic transitions of post-war law that made the 1948 seizures final and absolute. The rationale was simple. The wealth of Hermann Göring wasn't private property, it was the fruit of a criminal regime and systematic plunder. Giving it back to his daughter wasn't just a legal impossibility, it would have been a moral catastrophe. They told her in no uncertain terms that the state owed her exactly nothing. The doors she had been trying to kick down since she was 8 years old were officially welded shut. And get this, the rejection wasn't just about the money. It was about the validation she had been chasing her entire life. For Edda, getting that property back would have meant the world finally admitted that what they did to her after the war was wrong. She wanted the history books to say she was a victim. Instead, the 2015 ruling reaffirmed that she was simply the descendant of a monster, and the mistreatment she claimed was actually just the inevitable consequence of her father's actions. She stayed in her Munich flat, surrounded by those oil paintings and medals, until her death on December 21, 2018. Now, you'd think the death of the last Nazi princess would be a major news event, but it was shrouded in the same secrecy that defined her life. Her passing wasn't even announced until months later. When she was finally buried, it wasn't with a grand monument or a family name. She was laid to rest in an unmarked grave in Munich. The authorities and the family withheld the exact location entirely, and they still do today. Why? Because the fear of her grave becoming a pilgrimage site for neo-Nazis was and is incredibly real. She lived as a ghost of the Third Reich, and the German state made sure she stayed one even in death. It was the ultimate erasure. It really makes you stop and think about the concept of inheritance. Should the heirs of high-ranking Nazis ever be allowed restitution for what they lost? Or is the family name an eternal bar to any legal rights? Some people argue that a child shouldn't be punished for the father, but when the inheritance is literally stolen art and gold from a genocide, where do you draw the line? I'm genuinely curious. Should Nazi heirs get restitution debates, or should the door stay closed forever? Because this is one of those questions that has no easy answer. When you look back at the full arc of Edda's life, the reveal she promised wasn't some hidden secret about the war. It was the revelation of her own internal world. She spent 70 years in a state of total cognitive dissonance. She had her Uncle Albert, a man who saved over 120 lives by using the Göring name for good as a living example of a different path. But she chose the shrine. She chose denial. The mistreatment she faced, the poverty in the Wildenstein cottage, the job rejections, the social shunning, didn't lead her to the truth. It just made her more certain that she was the one being wronged. The full mistreatment arc ended in a silence that felt heavy. There was no deathbed confession, no late-night realization that her father was the architect of misery. She died believing she was the girl in the palace who had been unfairly robbed of her gold. She never saw the victims. She only saw the theft of her father's medals. Her story is a powerful reminder of how easily the human mind can use personal suffering to hide from a much larger, darker reality. Echoes through that unmarked grave, even now. A final testament to a legacy that was built on plunder and ended in total deserved obscurity. The princess died without a crown, without a palace, and without a name on her stone. And perhaps that was the only justice left to give. Edda Göring died at 80 with her father's shrine intact, proving that personal loss often forged her deepest denials. She was buried in a secret, unmarked grave, the final erasure of a princess who never repented. Did she deserve a second chance, or was her anonymity justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below.